Hello, my name is Matthew Kavinsky. I'm a product manager in the AdSense team here at Google. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Marshall Van Alstyne to Google today. Marshall's work concerns information economics. To add context on the subject, I'll say that Wikipedia states that information economics is a branch of economics that studies how information affects economic decisions. Information is special because it is easy to spread, but so hard to control. It is easy to create, but hard to trust. And it influences many of our decisions. However, this special nature of information complicates many standard economic theories. Information economics focuses on three areas: the study of information asymmetries, the economics of information goods, and the economics of information technology. Professor Marshall Van Alstyne will speak to us today about recent research that applies information economics to fighting spam. His talk will discuss how creating such a tension market can resolve problems more effectively than even a hypothetical quote-unquote perfect filter that has neither false positives nor false negatives. This multidisciplinary approach blends important ideas for solving pollution problems based on the Course theorem with signaling and screening. For those of you that saw Professor Stiglitz last week here at Google, he had pioneered the concept of screening. The result creates a market instead of shutting it down. The talk will also touch briefly on novel implications for privacy, advertising, and the spread of viruses in the new economy. Please note that this talk will be distributed on Google Video. Professor has invited questions throughout the talk, and just be aware of confidentiality information that you include in your questions because it will be on Google Video. It's my pleasure, and please help me in welcoming Marshall Van Alstyne to Google today.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming. Actually, we'll try to make this interesting, and I certainly welcome questions throughout the talk. Sometimes saving them till the end, it doesn't get much of a discussion going, so I actually like to have that happen, and feel free to interject at any point. I'll see if I can paraphrase the question and come back. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors in this work, Thi Loader and Rick Wash, have been instrumental in making sure that things have actually moved forward on this. But I'll give you a little bit of background on some of the information economic research we do. We cover a large number of different areas. This includes, for example, the economics of network and product design. And we look, for example, at how you would set standards, how you'd create barriers to entry, how would you price information goods is one of the first items. We also look at how information flows and communications might affect productivity. We ran a 5-year study sponsored by the National Science Foundation, tracking all the emails in a firm, all of the white-collar email, then correlating that with the productivity of the workers within the firm. So we could actually track the social networks and see what folks are doing with that. Happy to field questions on that after the talk. We also take a quick look at some economics of open source business models. How is it that you capture the broad properties of open access and distribution, and then perhaps recapture some of the benefits of incentive mechanisms as well, and can you bring those together? But the one I want to speak on today is really communications markets. Can we actually do something with communications and improve the problems with spam? So I'm going to see if I can introduce you to a couple of ideas from information economics, maybe make a controversial statement or two. Among those, we'll see if we can support the claim that we can actually do better for users than a hypothetical perfect filter with no false positives and no false negatives. And how is it we would be able to make that claim? So I want to see if I can walk you through some of the ideas of how we would actually support development on a communications market. Now, let me give you just overall agenda. The description of the problem we're going to tackle from a number of different dimensions. We'll take a look at it from a regulatory angle, from a technological angle, and suggest why I think there are going to be some difficulties taking that particular approach. And then want to move into the Coase theorem and show why a property rights approach might actually be very helpful in this particular context, and adding in some of the ideas, as Matt Conde mentioned, from Joe Stiglitz on signaling and screening. There's some very powerful ideas there for information revelation, finding the good information, finding the gems in among the bad. I want to compare it. I'll actually show you a model of what this would be like relative to a perfect filter, and let's see if we can actually do the comparison of why we think one would be better than the other. And then in the end, I'd like to cover some of the surrounding issues, not just the technology or why we think it works, but also cover some of the adoption, the free speech, the viruses and the spam zombie questions about how that would be affected by such a mechanism. Okay? So here's a little bit of data. This comes mostly from the Pew Internet Report or from the New York Times or some other sources. One of the estimated yearly losses to businesses are about 20 billion, maybe more. If you estimate $2 per head per month that winds up adding up very quickly, both in the United States and abroad. So it's quite a substantial amount if you look at the costs of filtering. The Federal Can-Spam Act went in place, enacted in 2004 with near unanimous support of Congress, superseding 8 state laws. But there's been almost no impact in the amount of spam. And if you look at the time, Right Mail was about 55% of all communications were spam in 2003. In 2004, it was up 77%. It's still hovering around there. You guys might even have more recent data than I on some of that. But it hasn't actually had much of a dent. Another interesting implication is that most of the spam comes from zombies at the moment. People, if you could actually trace it and find out who's sending it, you'd like to be able to shut it down. But a lot of it is being sent by these infected machines, and the owners of the machines are not aware that their machines are actually sending out spam. So how can we deal with that kind of a problem? And then lastly, there's a really interesting problem in that no one has been able to really effectively define spam, certainly not on the basis of content. If you look at the Pew Internet Report, most adults, 92%, would agree that adult or pornographic unsolicited communications are spam. But it's still something like 74% political and religious unsolicited communication is considered spam. This drops to 65% for charities, then down to 32% for unsolicited communications with a prior business relationship, and then all the way down to 11% for unsolicited communications, even when you granted them prior permission to send you solicitations. So it's really interesting trying to define it on the content or in some sense on these behaviors. This is a nice photograph down here of Alan Ralsky, interviewed by the New York Times, who vowed to carry on after the Can-Spam Act was enacted. Okay, so what are some of the issues with existing approaches to spam? If we take a look at the legislative approaches, we can look at things like taxing, banning, labeling, things of that. We've got difficulties first with defining spam, as we just noted with the definitions in the Pew Internet Report. We've also got a big problem with jurisdictional issues. If folks can reach anywhere across the internet, how is it that you can actually use laws to reach them? It gets very difficult to actually train them and get traction through the legal system. Or if you label it, you require labeling, then people simply set their filters to take a particular message, send it into the digital circular file, and then the effect of it is simply nullified, so that there's no incentive reason to actually label your message as advertising. And then finally, if you try taxing, it's very blunt because it affects all messages, not just advertising messages or spam messages. So we've got a big problem there. The technology, the filtering ones, I actually want to go into a couple of nice examples of that. There's some interesting things. Some of the most successful approaches are the Bayesian filters and some of the challenge response systems. Let me see if we can go into a couple nice examples of these. And again, I'm happy to take any questions on the technologies. Here's a fun one that was developed by someone presented at the MIT Spam Conference a short while ago. The idea is to tie up the TCP/IP port for those machines that are spewing spam messages. You can identify the ones that actually have too much traffic on them and try to tie them up. You had a very clever idea with TCP/IP pattern detection. This is an anomalous pattern, so you could say, error 451, your spam is important to us. Please stay online. That was a very innovative approach. This is one that you probably all will have seen, as you have had to take a completely automated public test to tell computers and humans apart, a typical CAPTCHA. So the idea here is that you need to do pattern recognition in a way that a computer often finds very difficult. The fascinating thing about this is that the spammers have inverted the CAPTCHAs. They now require, what they do is they send the CAPTCHAs out to human beings in exchange for pornography. So the humans solve the CAPTCHA problem for them, get them accounts from which they then send out spam. So it's an interesting way of inverting the computer test. Yes, question?
The other way that the spammers convert CAPTCHAs is that they send you email with the content in an image. So the spam detector has to figure out.
Beautiful example. What they do is they reverse the problem so that your filters can't pick it up. They'll send the spam in an image. I'll actually show you an example of that. Thank you. In just a moment. Another interesting problem, this is a nice illustration developed by fellow Jonathan Graham Cumming, how to beat an adaptive spam filter. The idea here is, if you can train a filter to recognize spam, you can train a filter to recognize spam, so that any technology can be used in the hands of an attacker to defeat the same technology. It provides an arms race reciprocity recursive definition problem. And in fact, when he tried it on his own email, he found that Berkshire, Marriott, and Wireless were effectively email kryptonite. They could always go through his filters. So we'd have to train it. But the idea is train one filter, you can train another filter. What these guys do is they take accounts on Yahoo and Amazon and AOL and others, and if the spam doesn't reach those accounts, they train it on the other side to realize that it hasn't gone through. So they've been doing some very clever things to get through. I want to take it a little bit farther, though. So I gave you a caution here. This is actual spam messages that have been sent out. So I give you full political correctness warning. A few of these are risque. So I want to take it a little bit farther and suggest there are reasons to believe this is going to be an extremely hard problem to solve. OK. Where is the word Viagra or naughty body part used in any of the following messages? All right, here's one. Get a rod like a fire hose. Right? That went straight through because it was actually using clever use of metaphor. They're using metaphors to actually figure it out, and the computer had not gotten that one. This is a linguistic one. Take a look now at this one. That's it. Right? Is your flower wilting? We'll help it grow. Right? I defy you to write a program that will recognize that kind of metaphor in advance when you haven't seen the metaphor and know what to anticipate. One of the ones that I thought was really fun was an adapted cartoon, which is there are all these cats and dogs showing up here with their tails erect. A fellow standing by his bedside is saying, that's odd, this bottle was full 2 days ago. Well, you and I know exactly what he's talking about, but of course, that's very hard to pick up in any kind of computer filtering system. So I'd like to argue that language and metaphor and visual images are sufficiently plastic. It is extremely hard to write a program to do that. At the point you can, you'll probably have a program that can pass the Turing test. So I'd like to suggest that there perhaps ought to be other ways to try to attack the problem.
Are these actual spams?
These are actual spams. These are actual spams. Right. So now I want to see if I can address the original problem. If we're going to address it, we first have to define spam. What I'd like to do is, what is spam? If we show that cascading list of different beliefs in what the content might be, there's no consensus agreement. I'd like to submit to you that in an economic sense, it's actually relatively easy to define. Spam is information or message pollution. It's that spillover of a small fraction of the market trying to reach some other small fraction of the market that's willing to buy fake Rolex watches or herbal supplements or diplomas or things like that. It's really a spillover, a negative externality. Once we recognize it as a pollution problem, we start to realize what other forms of analysis have been tried for this particular kind of a mechanism. Among them, we see exactly the same phenomenon that we've seen for spam. They are things like regulation, filters, and one more. For regulation, it's things like taxing the effluent at the rate of the damage. Another one that's particularly interesting, that's good revelation about the power of economic interpretation, is consider filters. If you apply a filter to a pollution problem, where do you put it? You put the scrubber on the pipe, on the effluent or the smokestack, and see if you can clean it at the source. One of the things you should see is that the current solutions to spam through technology have a really interesting problem. We're putting the filters at the destination. It is as if every man, woman, and child had to have the equivalent of a water filter or gas mask to drink or breathe because it's on the receiving end. That ought to suggest to you that it is extremely inefficient, and it's one of the reasons why the losses from spam are so high. It would be great if we could apply the technology at the source, but instead we're having to apply it at the back end. The other approach is economics. I'd like to suggest that the best way to do this in an economic sense is to apply the Coase theorem. This is, in effect, to assign property rights. Coase got the Nobel Prize in '91 for clarifying the significance of transactions costs and property rights in the institutional structure and functioning of the economy. If the traditional approach to solving pollution problems had been taxes, Coase argued that one of the most important things to do was to assign property rights in negative externalities. What's interesting is that the very year he got this was the very first year that they actually had carbon trading rights, pollution trading. This is one of the ways of starting to solve pollution problems. But let me drive it home in a more local sense. How many of you use an ATM card? OK, I see almost every hand is going up. All right? Let me see if I can give you an example of why economics and security systems matter. Here's a very nice illustration from Ross Anderson, why crypto systems fail. In the United States, liability for ATM fraud effectively rests with the bank. Unless the bank can prove the consumer's at fault, the bank has to assume responsibility for it. In the UK, liability rests with the customer. Unless a customer can prove the bank was at fault, the customer has to assume responsibility. Which is easier? Who has the record keeping and who has the security systems in place that would be responsible for it? What's interesting is that Anderson observes that the incidence of fraud in the UK was dramatically higher in the UK than the United States. The reason is effectively where you're putting the rights. In this case, you certainly want to put them with the consumer because the bank is in a better position to police the fraud, would have the incentives to do so, and it would be harder for the consumer to prove fraud in the other direction. Okay? So let's make it local to the spam question. All right? So if the Coase theorem the solution is to assign property rights, how are we going to do it? What we'd like to do is to assign property rights to your attention, the value of your time and what it is that you're doing. So what we'd like to do is to create a mechanism to charge for the waste that others create. How are we going to do that? We're going to assign the property rights to recipients. Yes, question?
So I think I get the idea, but if I'm supposed to have understood the Coase theorem and what it specifically is a theorem of, I didn't quite get that. Do you state the theorem?
Okay.
It's not background knowledge that I come from.
Okay, so the question is, can I give a clarification of the Coase theorem? Certainly. All right, let's see, we'll back up for just a second. The Coase theorem originally said that there are two pieces of the Coase theorem. One is that how you assign the property rights don't really matter because you can trade to get the efficient solution unless there are transactions costs. If there are transactions costs, you want to assign the property rights to the party with the higher cost of avoidance. In the ATM case, you and I have the higher cost of avoidance, so you assign the property rights to the person in the ATM. As a way to think about that. Okay? So that in a nutshell is the Coase theorem. Thank you. Okay. So again, in this case, we want to assign the property rights to the recipients. Imagine that you were to assign the property rights to the senders, and they could threaten to waste time and effectively encouraging extortion. They would offer to send as much unless you sold them the right. It's interesting. It seems obvious, but we have to be careful about it. The reason I say that is that we also think of the property right as a right to be heard. There are times when, as the sender, you do want your message to go out, and you'd think that you would want your message to reach another's ears. How would you do that? How would you balance that? Again, the last piece of this is the Coase theorem, which is that if the transactions costs are high, assign the property rights to the party with the higher cost of avoidance. And in this case, that would be you or I, the recipient, as opposed to the spammers, who are the parties who could decide not to send out that waste in the first place. Okay, so if I'm going to make a claim about whether or not this is better than a perfect filter, I'm going to need a model in order to be able to say which one is better and which one is worse, or which one wins and under what conditions. So what I want to do is I want to just present a little simple framework that I'm going to then illustrate graphically of how you could process messages and what the value of those messages might be. In the top is simply a representation of the lower bound and the upper bound on the value to a recipient for any given message. Here is a lower bound and upper bound on the value to a sender of any given message. The key distinction here is that a sender will know the value of a message before it's been sent because they composed it, they wrote it. The recipient won't know the value of a message until they've actually read it. So that's one element of the information asymmetry that we're going to try to model within the problem. So the recipient won't know her value until after reading it. They either can have a cost, the cost could be zero, it doesn't really matter. And filtering will reduce the number of messages to get through by some fraction. Very simple framework. Graphically, I want to represent it in the following way. If we put the value to the sender along the x-axis, everything above their value, their cost of sending, will be things that they would prefer to send. To the recipient, everything above their cost of processing would be things that they would want. Okay? So here, let me give you a couple examples of this. In the bottom right quadrant, the top right quadrant, are examples of things that are sent and that are wanted. These would be project updates from friends, long-lost high school buddies that managed to reach you, recruiting leads from friends, things like that. In the bottom right, These would be things that would be sent, but it would not necessarily be wanted. This might be market research or focus groups, polling, persuasion for vote X. As you get farther and farther more negative, you get pornography, phishing scams, and viruses and keyloggers, right? The sender would love to get that out, but the value to you, of course, would be negative. In the top left would be wanted, but not sent. These would be things like a personalized loan application, knowledge of your own credit history, subscription content or custom news. Google Answers is also a nice example of this kind of a problem. A little bit of interesting razzing is due here. I was actually quite curious what the value of Google Answers was, so I posted on Google Answers the question, how much revenue passes through Google Answers? The question was deleted. So an interesting question there. And the bottom left is not wanted, not sent. This would simply be messages that are actually counterfactual. You could envision embarrassing news sent to the wrong person, but you wouldn't expect to see it. So we'll be concentrating in the other three quadrants. OK. Total value is the value to all the parties involved. That is simply represented as the green area. So if you look at what's the value to the senders and what's the recipient, that's the total welfare. And that's everything above that 45-degree line, crossing through the cost. Again, I really don't care what the costs are. I can move that around anywhere, but that basic shape will hold. OK? So there's in the red, however, is negative value. That would be messages that effectively destroy total social value. Those would be the phishing scams and viruses and things that would get propagated. So can we then visualize the impacts of the different interventions? Well, let's take a look. On the far left, you can see as we increase the costs, this might represent taxes, stamps, computational challenges. You can see that the cost of sending an individual message shifts to the right, and so you're lopping disproportionately from messages that you don't want, which is the effect that you would hope for. Okay? If you take a look at filters, you get a different effect here. Filtering would lop off the things that the recipient doesn't want. If we have a jaggy line here, this might represent the false positives and false negatives for things that do get through that you didn't want and things that got filtered out that you did actually want. So that might be what a filter might look like. But notice, yes, quick question.
So I want to go back to your definition of value here. So there's an implicit sum over parties involved, and you came out with a 45-degree line as a result of that. I guess, can you say why you came out with a 45-degree line and what summation you're really doing there? I mean, if there's a two-party world where there's just one sender and one receiver, okay, that seems reasonable, but that's not the real world, right?
Disagree. All right. Okay. Let me for the benefit of others, let me just paraphrase the question. How do we get the sum of values as the 45-degree line, and is that realistic? The answer, in almost any trade situation, you'd always want to look at the surplus to both parties. The buyer and the seller would be a common metaphor for that. In economics, what you always want to do is to look at the total surplus across both parties. So it's the benefit to all of the transacting parties. That's why you want the gains from trade. As you transfer one good from one person to another, you'll get the decrement in value to the sender, presumably a higher increment to the buyer, which is why the transfer creates wealth. In this case, what we want to look at is when is it that a message transfer creates wealth? So the sum of those values will be this may be a region which is slightly negative to the recipient, but so positive they're willing to actually pay for it, such as market research. Here's where you get the credit report that you'd really like to know your own score, but it's costly for them to generate, so you want to pay them to do that. Is that representative? We actually think that you can represent almost any pairwise interaction that way. It would be a fairly standard mechanism to do that. That's how we get the 45-degree line. Thanks. Any other questions? OK.
I had a question about this, the portrayal of filtering. That's, I don't see how you can portray it like that on the graph. That's filtering can do things like select recipients. Not every recipient uses the same filter. So let's say you send a message which has a good externality for a sender, but to 1,000 people, and that people, each person has an individualized filter, and only the ones who want this get it, and the ones who don't.
OK, actually, so Let me paraphrase the question. Are the individualized nature of filters would be representative in this? So each different people would have different filtering preferences, so different messages might go through. The beauty of this is that we actually want to represent, this would be the preferences of an individual user. So a message that might be positive to you and not to me would have a very different schedule in this, but you can still represent it as the pairwise interaction with your preferences or my preferences, whichever one you happen to be enacting at that time. So it should be a very good representation of whatever your preference, whatever you want is going to go through to you. All this does is it operates without cost. It makes no mistakes by your definition and lets those messages through and no others. That's all that does. So again, we want to make it a perfect filter by an individual person's definition, and then we aggregate over different people. Okay? All right. Notice these messages get filtered out, and those messages are messages that aren't generated. So what I want to imply is exactly the classic gains from trade that you have from economics. Is there room for any negotiation? Is there room for creating wealth by encouraging messages to get sent that should have been sent, or compensating folks for messages that senders want to get out and you don't necessarily want them? How is it we're going to actually achieve something like that? Is there region for gain? Again, what I want to argue is not so much that the mechanism we're going to propose is better at false positives or negatives. It's not. What it should be better at is giving you more of the messages that you do want and fewer of the messages that you don't want, and for those that you don't, you actually get compensated, so both parties turn out to be better off. Okay? As an example of this, messages that aren't sent up here, we actually did find, we got challenged when we first put this out. Oh, these messages aren't sent, clearly they don't exist. Actually, we found some great examples. Here's one from the New York Times, someone who's paying $4.15 for each sales lead that comes to this flower shop. And Google Answers is actually a really nice example of this, where you post a bond in order to get information tailored to your specific answers. So it really is an example of that top left quadrant. Okay? So this raises a difficult problem, though. If we go back to the Coase theorem, it actually assumes costless negotiation. Well, now we got a problem. Because how are you going to negotiate to send communication when communication itself is the source of the problem? We've got a nasty catch-22 here. How are we going to resolve that? Well, in this case, we're going to go use the ideas of signaling and screening. There's an information asymmetry present. That is, one person knows the message content and another person does not. That's the information asymmetry. The person that wrote the message knows the content. The recipient has no idea. If it's a stranger, they don't know the person and they haven't read the message. So we're going to use the resolution to information asymmetry problems is typically found in signaling and screening. Signals are actions taken by the informed party to tell you that they really know something. Suppose that you're considering two identical products, and you're offered a warranty. You're offered one product as is, and you're offered the other product with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Which product would you have more confidence in purchasing in terms of its quality? The warranty serves as a signal of the higher quality good, because it's an expensive prospect. If they're going to have to take it back, then they're going to actually have to incur a cost. They know the seller of a higher quality good is more willing to warranty its claimed function than someone who has a low quality good. Screening is a choice taken by the uninformed party. This is how you separate out good type from the bad type. For example, when an insurance contract is let out on a life insurance policy, often it won't kick in for 6 months or a year from the date of purchase. Why is that? Well, the person taking out the life insurance policy would have much better information on whether or not they're likely to have a terminal illness. So you write one policy if you're going to insure for time zero. You write a different policy if you're going to insure from the future. You're more likely to separate out people who know whether or not they have a terminal illness by using that kind of a contract, by using that kind of a screen. So we're going to use those kinds of mechanisms to separate out the good, legitimate senders, legitimate advertisers and long-lost friends from spammers who know the content of their messages. Okay. So if the sender knows more about the message than the receiver, what we want to do is force them to reveal that private knowledge. We want to screen based on intent rather than content. I tried to argue earlier that because of metaphors and the technological difficulty, that is a very, very hard thing to do. What we're going to do is, rather than doing an ex-ante classification problem of the content, which is extremely difficult, we want to do an ex-post classification of was it spam, which is really easy. So what we do is we ask an unknown sender to simply post a small amount into escrow, a tiny bond. The recipient gets to choose that in proportion to their opportunity cost. I'll show you why in a moment. They'll choose it directly in proportion to their own opportunity cost of time. Unknown senders post that. Otherwise, their messages don't come through. It's simply dinged. So if you're not recognized and you're not willing to promise that it's not spam, you never clutter the person's mailbox. On reading the message, the recipient chooses to claim or return the bond after the fact. Okay? It's like returning the product based on whether or not it actually did what it said it was going to do. The effect is the willingness to post that helps to screen people who have the intention of sending legitimate mail from the people who have the intention of sending illegitimate mail. A spammer cannot afford to make that promise because they will break it, and the cost basis doesn't justify it. They can't make any money. They currently make money on 1 in 10,000 messages or so. If they're going to if enough people claim these bonds, they can't do that. It economically won't make any sense. It shifts the task from ex-ante classification, which is really hard, to ex-post verification, and that's easy. And it also compensates you directly for any wasted time.
Question? You've just reversed the problem. The problem is not, the sender does not have perfect information about the transmission. In fact, the sender often doesn't know much about the recipient. So now you'll just have spammers trying to fool you into sending them email and collecting the bond.
I like that. All right, so the question is, have we just reversed the problem about senders identifying which recipients they want? Actually, I'll come back to that in a little bit about honeypots and reputation systems. I think you're absolutely correct, but I think we have the solution for that, all right? In a nutshell, what we're going to look at is marketers, spammers aren't going to want to send to honeypots, and marketers aren't going to want to send to it either. So the list should become self-correcting. I'll come back to that in a couple of slides, okay? Okay, this is simply an example protocol of this. Actually, one of my colleagues, when we first discussed it, implemented a low-level version of this in PayPal. And I know there's some other companies that have actually tried to implement this kind of thing in Massachusetts. So here's what would happen if a sender sends a message, initially sends it out, it then goes to the recipient's mail server. And if they're not a stranger, it simply gets delivered. It goes straight on through. If they are a stranger, then there's a simple bond challenge. It's like a computational challenge, but instead of a puzzle, it's actually a modest amount of currency specified by the recipient. It's then authorized by the escrow service, or if it were an unusual amount, in those rare cases, then the sender might have to authorize it or not. Suppose it were a bond challenge in the amount of $10 as opposed to 2 cents. Then you would want to actually have some veto power over it. But usually this would just happen in the background with no human intervention. Okay, so either they could authorize it or deny it. Once the money is escrowed, it's in the third-party safe house, and then the recipient is notified and the message is delivered. At which point the recipient can simply acknowledge and return the bond, and it goes back, or it simply expires so that the money can simply be reused again, or not at all. Yeah?
I can think of an attack. Get a botnet to spam addresses that you own and leech money out of these people.
That viral attack is exactly one of the things that, that was one of the nastiest problems to solve. We actually have a solution to, all right, so the question was, can you use a botnet to actually, shall we say, infect the machines and then drain the accounts? We actually have a great solution to that. I'll ask you with an anticipatory question, do you carry a credit card? If you do, then we will have solved your problem. Hold on to it. Okay. Now, the last one was a warning on risque messages. This is a warning on economics. So I fear I'm going to have a couple of equations up here because I wanted to justify the claim that I made earlier. All right. So without going into a great deal of detail, most of this is actually in our paper. The first equations, all of these do is they calculate the area in which which the choice of bond would be and how much value that would create. So it's a calculation of that area up there. We can then calculate what the total amount of benefit to the recipient would be. That's what those equations do. Then we look at the total amount of benefit, the area from the perfect filter, and we can compare those two areas to see when one dominates. It is not always the case that the bond can beat a perfect filter. There are plenty of occasions when a perfect filter can actually do better. But plenty of situations exist in which it is actually possible for this solution to leave the users with greater benefit than even a perfect filter. And that is actually the gist of the mathematical proof that we provide in the paper to show what happens. But we've shown it graphically, and you can see as you move the spaces around why it might be the case that we could recover some of those yellow areas that are lost by filtering mechanisms, precisely because it promotes trade and exchange. Okay? So here's how you choose the bond, and here's how you'd set it to your opportunity cost. If you, that would be the basic message. If, as you increase the choice of bond, there's the risk of seizing something, and the potential cost goes up to sender. If you send it up too high, you risk losing valuable messages that you would want. So you'll want to reduce that to a level where you don't risk losing too many valuable messages. But notice that if you do get messages you don't want, your value is actually increasing in this range, so that you're actually, because of the transfer payment effect, if you actually do claim the message. So that's the sense in which you're compensated for wasteful communication, right? And what you're doing is you're literally maximizing the area in that region, but you're really just setting it proportional to your opportunity cost of time is what you're doing. Okay? And if we introduce different classes of senders, there would be different distributions with different effects. So, for example, if that were the class of friends, relatives, aunts, and uncles, so there's effectively good mail up there, some messages you didn't necessarily want in there. And that's the class of bad mail from spammers, advertisers, or things often that category of other consumption where folks consider it spam. And you can see what the effects of the different mechanisms are as you've got more of the area above this line in actual captured surplus as opposed to here where it's simply filtered and thrown away, right? So we've done, again, simply try to demonstrate across multiple distributions that it's possible to actually do better by users and by senders by promoting an exchange in a mechanism where we didn't have to negotiate. We used signaling and screening mechanisms to actually get that to happen. Okay? One quick question, this one comes up from the economists, they're always very draconian in this, is why not just seize the bond all the time? Well, there are a couple reasons why you might not do this. One of these is you want to distinguish yourself from a honeypot, so that if you want particular kinds of messages, you want news on camping gear, or you want something, you don't claim those kinds of messages. The other thing is you can easily implement a feedback mechanism on this. The feedback on eBay, for example, exceeds 96% positive ratings. These feedback mechanisms are very powerful at getting people to do the right thing. The action at a distance among strangers, when you report on their behaviors, tends to lead to very accurate behaviors or congenial behaviors in there. So we think those kinds of mechanisms can help solve that particular problem and not seizing it all the time.
Well, that allows people to threaten negative feedback and start using.
Well, if they could do that, but if there's, when is it worth your time to threaten for 2 cents or a nickel, right? It's probably not worth it at that point, right? And if you could just refund it at 2 or 5 cents and you're not out anything, even if you wanted to. The question was, why not threaten to extort on that, just like at the beginning? I think that transactions cost is probably just not worth it. Question in the back.
What's the need networks of collaborators sending each other emails in such a way that they build a positive reputation that say you lease all the bonds that carry a high rate of money file? Same as eBay bidders that sell that to
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the question is, what about shill bidders, which pump each other's reputation? There you can use exactly the same kinds of mechanisms that eBay currently uses to identify shill bidders. When the things go back and forth with no communication outside a particular closed network, you can often use that network topology to identify subnodes, subnetworks that are problematic. I also suspect that, I'll show in a moment, the folks that do marketing will be very careful and will only use a couple of test messages, and your reputation will become very valuable over time, exactly as your credit cards do. They'll try to sell you particular kinds of services based on your past behaviors. And it's your behaviors in transactions with other third parties that will help to determine what additional information you get as a result of that. So it should converge over time.
This is for people who send out spam currently, but what the individuals don't have those kind of knowledge about the recipients. if you get an email from, let's say, somebody who wants to be a customer or is interested in your website or something you wrote, and you have no way to tell whether that individual is going to seize your bond or not if you reply to it.
One thing that you should never do is you would easily set your default so that you would never reply with a bond. Anyone who's coming in and spamming has the problem of first reaching you, putting their bond at risk, but to a response, you don't do it. Someone has already solicited you, and you should never attach a bond in reverse. That should solve that problem. It's a great example of an adverse selection problem, but they have to put their stuff at risk before they can even reach your mailbox, and you probably won't respond. It's an interesting question. Okay. No. So let's go on to some of the let's go precisely on to some of these adoption infrastructure and policy issues, some of the honeypots and questions like that. How would we actually deal with some of those questions? Okay. One of these is consider the advantages for direct marketing. Anyone know what the costs of printing and posting a direct mail piece is? Well, I'm at Google. I really expected someone to have an answer for that.
We're not in the direct mail.
Okay, all right, not in that side. All right. Direct mail cost for printing and postage, if you include the actual cost of creating the document and then the bulk rate mailing, it costs at least 30 cents, maybe sometimes 60 cents to do that. So a direct mail piece can actually be fairly expensive. In comparison with that, the economics of this are extremely attractive. You could probably get something posted, at least, for somewhere between 2 and 5 cents in a mechanism like this. So the relative economics on a one-to-one basis are extremely attractive. Second, the receiver gets the benefit, not the printer or the mailer. If you're getting direct mail, you would get the benefit. You would actually go into your bank account as opposed to spending it on third-party access. And if you don't want it, it's also not polluting the environment in this case. You're not circular filing it, so it's all digital. Another thing that happens in this is that you get more information on the other end. You get vastly better information than on TV, radio, or even direct mail campaigns, because if they claim the bond, they've effectively told you they don't want communication on this topic. And there's no way to get that same information on a direct mail campaign. If they act positively to make a purchase, that doesn't cover the ground where, geez, they're kind of interested, but you didn't have anything in the catalog this time that you really wanted. Here, you get direct feedback on the preferences when folks say, I don't want any more of this. So in some sense, your lists become self-cleaning. And from the question in the back from earlier, direct marketers will be very adroit at looking at who has claimed these things in the past and sending them more of the kinds of information on which they have not been claiming the bonds, because that's the nature of the preferences they have expressed through their own behaviors. Okay? If you take a look at the marketing of that, the size of the direct marketing spending is about 52 billion, and this is of about 270 billion in advertising. These numbers are actually from 2004 from the US Statistical Abstract. So I suspect you guys may have even better numbers on advertising as a whole than I. In this case, they claimed internet advertising was only about $7 billion. It may be more. I suspect I'll be getting no information on that. In any event, the ad market is actually quite large in this case, and you may be able to do lots of resource reallocation for the benefit of users as opposed to spending it on printing and postage. Okay? Now consider the advantages for users. Suppose that you were outside a system protected by this kind of a mechanism, and you send your very first message to a person in the network protected by such a mechanism. What happens? Well, the first thing is you might get a challenge response back that says, okay, adopt this plugin, and you'll get the following 4 things. First, you'll get your message delivered, so it'll actually go through. Second, your spam problem will be eliminated, because all in the future, anyone else having to reach you will have to then engage in similar behavior, so you won't have a spam problem. Third, you won't have to do this challenge response thing again for anyone protected by this mechanism of the network. So no more captures for you. This thing has been solved once for everyone else inside the network. And fourth, oh yeah, we're going to create a small bank account on your behalf into which advertisers can start dropping nickels. All of a sudden, the adoption dynamics look a lot more attractive when you're actually suddenly getting paid or underwritten to do something like that. I would submit to you there's even another interesting variant on this. The advertising market is around $270 billion. Anyone know what the size of the credit card market is in the United States? All credit instruments and ATM cards, debit cards. Any idea what that is? It's approximately $1.7 trillion. Imagine the possibility that if you were to attach this kind of a mechanism to the email channel, you could have the equivalent of Amazon one-click to any kind of e-commerce purchase anywhere. All of a sudden, you can start to tap into that $1.7 trillion market as opposed to the $270 billion market. And now you're talking real money. So it may be possible to actually do something interesting with the economics of it if you can actually get a tiny piece of that revenue stream. Because anyone with a system like this could use it to make purchases from Amazon, use it to make purchases from magazine subscription, LL Bean, anything conducted online. OK? How about concerns? This raises a number of interesting concerns. I've heard, for example, honeypots and viruses, at least among some of them. So let me see if we can actually address some of those. OK? One of these, honeypots. All right? Great. I'll set up a honeypot and retire. So here's one possibility. As a marketer, what's your incentive to indiscriminately mail bonds to buyers in the presence of honeypots? Answer? Almost none. You will start to be very careful because you want to start targeting those. Those are expensive messages. Now you're going to target them, as direct mail pieces are targeted, to people who are good prospects in this particular area. This is exactly what should happen. In effect, we have caused the people who are spamming, or in this case advertising, to internalize the costs of the waste that they produce. By internalizing that cost, they start to focus their messages on good prospects, the matching preferences, and this is exactly the behavior that we want. Question?
I don't really want to give out information about what I prefer, but when I accept or reject a bond, I implicitly do that. For a while, I could sort of say, well, we'll put in an anonymous bond acceptance thing, but actually it's kind of fundamental that you know whether or not somebody accepted or rejected a bond.
Absolutely. Fine point. So the question is, what about privacy with respect to your own preferences? There are at least two different solutions to that. One would be to use an account that won't post that information, in which case marketers would probably have to assume that you are potentially a honeypot and know it's very high risk using that. Another is that you could use an account that does post the information but provide muddy signals. You could post a very high bond and never sees it. You could post a very low bond and always sees it, in which case there's no preference elicitation. So any of those mechanisms might actually achieve the privacy goal that you're talking about. OK? Second one. This is one that's kind of interesting, a nice one actually. Won't a financial mechanism exclude much of the world's poor who have no bank accounts? I think the intent of this one is actually a very nice one. I actually think there's a really good set of issues in here, right? But to be honest, I actually think this is asking the wrong question. I think that a better thing to do is to ask, how can a financial system be used to help the poor in a situation like this? Really, the question is, if we take a look at the moment, advertising supports the access to television and radio for millions of people at present. Why couldn't it also be used to support access to ISPs for millions more people at present? I think there's a better way to view this, which is, what is the one thing that the world's poor would have in great abundance? Time. Time. But they can't transact on their labor at a distance. Imagine the potential that if you're actually able to give folks a bank account and give them a means of communicating and transacting at a remote distance anywhere around the world, and you could underwrite that with a form of advertising, then all of a sudden you might actually be able to do a great deal of good. And I actually think there could be a possibility of that. If you're skeptical, anyone know what happened last Friday with the award of the Nobel Peace Prize? It was actually awarded to Muhammad Yunus for microcredit. Microcredit is a form of loan given out to some of the world's poorest people in Bangladesh, and it is an extraordinary accomplishment because it helped to create wealth. What they did is they allowed very, very small loans to poor Bangladeshis that apply for these loans in small groups, and no one else in the group can actually get the loan until the rest is paid off. They claim the repayment rate is easily as high as conventional banks in a system like this. So they're using microcredit. And I'm going to argue that it may be possible to do that kind of thing in the communications channels, to underwrite it and actually provide transactions and facilitate trade at a distance. The one thing they have got in abundance is time, and I think we can actually take advantage of that. OK. This is an interesting one. Doesn't this risk limiting free speech? I am totally honest that compared to a baseline no intervention case, this actually does introduce more friction on communication than no intervention whatsoever. But I want to pose the question to you, with respect to what? Do you want the no intervention case where if you're trying to get a message out, it's very hard for you to rise above the noise? At the moment, you might well be interpreted as spam because it's very hard to distinguish legitimate communications from illegitimate communications. This would at least give you a mechanism for filtering out legitimate communications from illegitimate communications. There's also an interesting problem. Remember the original slide on the data as how many people think political and charitable speech are spam. It was 74% for political speech and 65% for charitable speech. If people tune their filters to turn that stuff out, you can't get through. If what you're comparing it to is a filtering mechanism where the individuals can choose to set their filters to what they think is spam and you're trying to get a political message out, you can't get through at all because there's no negotiation. With a mechanism like this, you could get through. If you set it as a tax, again, the same thing. You get 74% collecting it versus everyone paying it. I think there are actually certain advantages for a mechanism like this. There's one additional advantage that's quite significant. And this is that would you want any centralized authority determining which content you got? Would you like the Chinese government, the North Korean government, or even Yahoo or AOL Time Warner determining which content was communicated over communications channels? If I'm not mistaken, and I may be on this, I believe that Yahoo may have policies against soliciting people on Yahoo for other ISPs' accounts. Well, why not extend that to critiques of Yahoo or other things like that? A mechanism like this is actually completely decentralized and content neutral. It makes it possible for almost any kind of communication to go through, and there's no centralized authority that gets to determine which content is legitimate and which content is illegitimate. So I would argue that partly in comparison to other potential mechanisms, it actually has a couple of very desirable properties. So that was one of the questions on free speech. Now, how about the one on spam zombies? All right, someone had asked about spam zombies on that. If 65% of spam is sent by infected zombies, doesn't this create a user nightmare? And one of the biggest problems is, and this one came up from, originally when we heard this, was actually on Slashdot. When we first published some of our research, we got Slashdotted, and one of the biggest objections was, well, what happens when all of a sudden the spammers can seize grandma's account? All you're going to be doing is spending grandma's money. Grandma can't be a systems administrator, doesn't want to be a systems administrator. Isn't that a terrible thing? I had to admit at the time that sounded like a very serious objection. I think actually there's a very simple solution. Okay? How many of you have credit cards? How many of you have ever paid for major fraud on your credit card? All right, almost every hand went up for a credit card, but almost no hand is going up for actually paying on major fraud. Why? The credit card company knows that the expected value of your transaction so far exceeds the expected value of your losses, they're willing to insure you in order to get the value of your business. Suppose what we do is that we simply insure folks against fraud on their account, provided that the ISP gets to maintain the antiviral software. Now grandma doesn't have to be a systems administrator, and we've used the Coase theorem to put the incentives and the property rights in an area where someone actually wants to maintain it and has the skills to do it. This could actually make it harder to infect grandma's machine. So if we use these mechanisms carefully, it may be possible to actually thwart the spread of viruses. You can also think about some of the propagation and detection mechanisms from the bigger networks. If you were to try to spend down grandma's account, you might try two different approaches. One, you could either try to spend all of her account at one time. Well, this is almost surely anomalous because grandma isn't sending out all of these messages all at one time the way a spammer might, right? So that would probably flag it exactly as the transactions are pulled up on credit cards when they start making $3,000 purchases of plasma TVs. I actually had this happen, and MX called me about it. Now consider the possibility that they strike, geez, I'll take a nickel from this account, a nickel from this account, a nickel from this account. At present, there's no feedback mechanism. There's no information going back to the infected owner to let you know that your machine's infected. With this mechanism, one of these parties is likely to say, geez, I didn't mail this. What happened? You build in a detection mechanism so that a centralized authority can figure it out and say, gee, maybe they didn't. Maybe there are a couple of these other messages that we can actually start tracing it. So you start to create an information trail to figure out which machines are detected. So we think that it may be possible to detect the attacks through the patterns better with a mechanism like this than via existing mechanisms. Okay? So let me leave you with a couple of parting thoughts. Okay? One of these is the potential social benefits. In comparison to direct marketing, we think it's vastly better than existing things like direct mail. It's cheaper. The receiver gets the benefit as opposed to the communications channel, provides information feedback, and it avoids harmful reputation effects in there. Recipients also now have, one really interesting thing is recipients now have reason to publish their contact information. At present, I hide several of my contact email boxes in GIF images because I don't want web crawlers to actually spider and then send me more spam. With a mechanism like this, it doesn't matter. You want to publish this information because then people who reach you, only the legitimate folks are willing to take the risk if they're a stranger. So you now publish that contact information as opposed to hide it. We shift the arms race to crypto. It's this ex post verification and the cryptography in the bonds. And this is a much more easily winnable arms race than the problem of trying to detect, is this a metaphor for herbal Viagra or not? That's an extremely difficult problem to solve. It permits otherwise potentially filtered communication. If you tune your filters to tune out certain kinds of political messages, those simply don't get through at all. And this would actually help it go through. It also tailors to individual preferences. If we looked at that whole cascading different series of who believed what is spam, each of you can have a different set of preferences, and you can decide to seize it or not, depending on what you prefer. Finally, this is kind of fun. It lets you reclaim the value of your mailbox from any marketer, from any list. Once you've gotten on someone else's list, you may be able to get off of it, but they often require you to go 12 pages deep into some HTML file. Now, take them off your whitelist. If they abuse your attention, then they're going to have to bond themselves in order to get back through again. So you can get off any list you want because you've got the property right in your own time and attention, as opposed to assuming that they have it. So we think that it actually gives you a lot of more benefit in that. So it really helps you get off at any of those lists. So let me leave you with a couple of parting thoughts on that. One of the biggest things I think we've done is to actually recognize what spam is. If you define it as information pollution, then you see a whole host of other phenomena associated with spam and figure out why it is that different approaches work or don't work, and why it is that the technology solutions are so inefficient and they make each and every one of us put on filters when it should, in fact, be the burden on the people sending the mail. The property rights provide these very valuable signals in the attention market. They tell you what time and attention are worth, and they help to elicit the preference information. You get lots of revelation about people's desires, what they do want and what they don't want, as is captured in these reputations. And also, there is a little potential for a little bit of strategic interactions as you do get these honeypot potentials. That's absolutely one of the potentials, but it does force the spammers and the advertisers to internalize their own costs. So it's got these feedback mechanisms. And combined with these two-sided insurance markets, you can reduce the spread of viruses and spam zombies. So it's a whole system of economic principles that we can actually use to try to address the problem and help shut it down. So with that, let me see if I can take any further questions. We do have a full paper academic. I have some popular treatments of this that we're happy to share on interest. And at the end, we're also still happy to take any questions on the productivity or the economics of open source questions. I think you had a question.
So you've managed to address all the problems that we have found in the system. Well, are there any problems that you have found in the system that you don't have answers to yet?
Are there any problems? Oh, I like that question. Are there any problems that we haven't found good answers to yet? There are a couple of really subtle attacks. One of the cleverest attacks I heard was if you could get into grandma's computer, could you seize an incoming bond and grandma wouldn't know about it and the other person would just think grandma's a jerk? That was one of the cleverer ones to do that. I think there are ways of getting around that as well, but that's one where I think there's going to need some more thought for that particular kind of problem. All of these, once you put financial transactions on the table, you create more incentives for folks to move in and actually skim off some of the value. Those are different attacks, and I think there are some solutions to that, but I think we can also use some of the economics to just make it not worthwhile when what's on the table is 2 cents or 5 cents. Yes?
Speaking of 2 cents and 5 cents, a lot of people have tried to implement micropayments and have found that the actual costs are more than the 2 cents and 5 cents. How does this get around?
Okay, all right. That's a great question. That's a setup question here. We'll pay for that with a good setup question. All right. Why don't micropayments work? All right. You know, people have tried micropayments. Why don't they work? All right. Let me give you 2 different answers to that. All right. One of them is that advertising works when you can track the transactions across a platform. When the original micropayment systems for advertising were set up, they were kind of out-of-band channel, and you weren't looking at the communications. The nice thing about TV and radio is that you know when someone's watching sci-fi or kiddie programming. You know if they're listening to classical or listening to rock. You need to track the transactions across the platform to elicit that preference information. And if you don't have that, then you're getting mistargeted ads. And there was also a big problem that the amounts that people were talking about were below the opportunity cost of people, so there's no reason for people to go there. So there's an out-of-bound versus inbound communications problem. Now, the reason it's a great setup is actually because the real answer is also found in two-sided markets. And that's actually a special area of research that we've been working on. Matter of fact, there's an article in this month, the October 2006 Harvard Business Review, on two-sided markets and why those things help solve those kinds of problems. Anytime you introduce a new payment system, you're going to have resistance in the system. Imagine, how long did it take for credit cards to take hold initially? How long did it take for American Express to launch? Matter of fact, they recently sued MasterCard Visa for being entrenched and not being able to get in. There are very, very powerful network effects. The issue is really, anytime you've got a new kind of a payment system, why are merchants going to accept that form of payment unless consumers carry it? Why are consumers going to carry it unless merchants accept it? You've got a two-sided market, and you must solve that problem simultaneously. The original micropayment systems didn't actually do that. To solve that, you need to subsidize one side of the market. What's the subsidy? In credit cards, you and I get free frequent flyer points. That's a subsidy. As long as you're paying your bill on time, that encourages you to do it. You're also getting the free insurance on that. So you're getting, unlike if you're carrying $200 in cash or $1,000 with you in cash when you're traveling, you've got additional insurance on your card that you don't have in cash. So you're getting these additional benefits, these additional subsidies. If you solve the two-sided market problem, you can introduce a new payment system. I'm quite convinced you can actually do that.